December 1942. The dense, rotting canopy of Guadalcanal drips with incessant monsoon rain. Deep in the malarial shadows of the jungle, a detachment of the Imperial Japanese Army crouches in the mud. They are the remnants of a proud infantry regiment, now reduced to gnawing on roots, palm fronds, and the boiled leather of their own belts. Through the oppressive foliage, a hollow-eyed sentry peers toward the contested coastline. Down on the beach, bathed in the harsh glare of floodlights, American transport ships are unloading in a continuous, deafening rhythm. It is not just ammunition or rifles. Heavy bulldozers roll down the ramps of landing craft. Mountains of wooden crates containing fresh medical supplies, waterproof boots, and canned meat are stacked higher than the palm trees. The sentry watches an American Marine casually toss a half-eaten tin of rations into the dirt, more sustenance than the Japanese squad has seen in 10 days. To the starving defenders of the Emperor, this is not merely a display of military strength. It is a terrifying glimpse into an industrial leviathan that simply cannot be starved out, setting the stage for a new, mechanized era of attrition. Spring 1942. The map of the Pacific Ocean is rapidly swallowed by the expanding shadow of the rising sun. In less than 6 months, the Imperial Japanese military has executed one of the most astonishing campaigns of conquest in human history. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor to the dense rubber plantations of Malaya, from the fortress of Singapore to the volcanic ash of the Philippines, the Western powers have been systematically shattered. The Japanese perimeter now stretches across millions of square miles of open ocean and hostile jungle. It is a staggering empire built on speed, shock, and a deeply ingrained, uncompromising martial philosophy. In the war rooms of Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters operates under a doctrine that fundamentally attempts to defy the mathematics of war. This is the concept of Yamato Damashi, the invincible Japanese spirit. The High Command believes, with absolute and fatal conviction, that the spiritual purity, brutal discipline, and sheer willpower of the Japanese infantrymen can overcome any material deficiency. In the military academies, combat officers are elevated to the status of modern samurai, while quartermasters and supply clerks are quietly scorned. Logistics, the unglamorous, painstaking science of shipping food, fuel, and boots, is treated not as a vital artery of combat, but as an afterthought. It is widely considered a merchant's concern, entirely beneath the dignity of a true warrior. This dangerous philosophy breeds a military machine designed to travel incredibly light and strike with blinding speed. The Japanese soldier goes into combat with minimal logistical tether, carrying just enough rice, pickled plums, and ammunition to survive a few days of intense fighting. The official doctrine dictates a strategy of living off the land. Advancing armies are expected to confiscate local harvests and seize enemy stockpiles to sustain their momentum. In the opening months of the war, this aggressive strategy appears flawlessly effective. During the lightning-fast invasion of Malaya, Japanese troops ride bicycles down the peninsula, moving through the jungle faster than the retreating British can react. When they run out of fuel for their light tanks, they simply capture British petrol dumps. When the supposedly impenetrable fortress of Singapore falls, the victorious Japanese inherit massive warehouses overflowing with allied canned goods, medical supplies, and artillery shells. These early, intoxicating victories create a fatal illusion among the top brass. The High Command becomes arrogant, convinced that their frontline troops will always be able to feed themselves from the spoils of a defeated, decadent enemy. But the Pacific Ocean is not the European continent. It is a vast, unforgiving void covering 1/3 of the Earth's surface. There are no paved roads, no interconnected rail networks, and no fertile European farms to pillage. The Pacific Theater requires a military to project power across thousands of miles of deep water. Relying entirely on vulnerable merchant ships, the Maru fleet, to deliver every single bullet, bandage, and grain of rice. By the summer of 1942, the Japanese Empire has fatally overextended itself. The defensive perimeter is now anchored on remote, malaria-infested outposts in the Solomon Islands and the impenetrable, jagged mountain ranges of New Guinea. The supply lines stretching back to the home islands are pulled to the absolute breaking point. The same civilian merchant fleet required to haul vital oil, rubber, and bauxite from the conquered Dutch East Indies back to the hungry factories in Tokyo is simultaneously tasked with feeding hundreds of thousands of men scattered across isolated atolls. There are simply not enough hulls in the water to sustain this sprawling web. The harsh reality of the South Pacific quickly shatters the illusion of living off the land. As Japanese garrisons dig into the rotting, rain-soaked jungles of Guadalcanal and the steep inclines of the Kokoda Track, they find an environment entirely hostile to human survival. There are no native farms to raid, and the indigenous populations have largely vanished into the hills. The thick jungle canopy blocks the sun, the acidic soil yields nothing edible, and tropical diseases like dengue fever, dysentery, and malaria begin to silently ravage the ranks. The Japanese soldier, abandoned at the absolute furthest edges of the empire, is left scanning the empty horizon, waiting for supply ships that are increasingly delayed. The doctrine of spiritual superiority is about to violently collide with the cold, unforgiving laws of industrial warfare. As the isolated Japanese forces slowly realize that willpower cannot generate calories or manufacture bullets, the sleeping giant across the ocean is mobilizing to fight an entirely different kind of war. Half a world away from the rotting jungles of the South Pacific, the sky over the United States burns orange with the glow of blast furnaces. It is the winter of 1942, and the American mainland is undergoing a violent, unprecedented metamorphosis. While the Japanese Imperial High Command banks on the spiritual endurance of its frontline infantry, the United States places its faith in something entirely different: the deafening, unyielding power of the assembly line. The arsenal of democracy has awakened, and it is treating the Pacific War not as a test of martial spirit, but as an immense, oceanic problem of engineering and logistics. In Detroit, the massive automobile plant ceased producing civilian sedans overnight. They are stripped to the studs and retooled to churn out heavy bombers, Sherman tanks, and millions of reliable mechanized transport trucks. In the steel mills of Pittsburgh, workers pull grueling double shifts, casting the raw materials of global war. But the most critical transformation occurs on the coastlines. American strategists quickly realize that every tank, bullet, and soldier produced in the heartland is entirely useless unless it can be transported across the largest body of water on Earth. The United States needs a bridge of ships. Enter the Liberty ship. Conceived as an emergency cargo vessel, it is an ugly utilitarian freighter with a simple reciprocating steam engine. Yet, it is a masterclass in mass production. In the shipyards of California and Oregon, industrialists like Henry J. Kaiser apply the principles of the auto assembly line to shipbuilding. Instead of slowly constructing vessels from the keel up in a single dry dock, entire sections of the ships are prefabricated across the country, shipped by rail, and welded together at the water's edge in a matter of days. At the peak of this industrial frenzy, American shipyards are launching a new cargo ship every single day. The numbers are staggering. In one famous instance, the SS Robert E. Peary is assembled and launched in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The United States is literally building merchant ships faster than the Axis powers can manufacture the torpedoes required to sink them. This explosive industrial output is paired with a military doctrine that fundamentally differs from Japan's. The American High Command, led by figures like General George C. Marshall and Admiral Ernest King, views logistics as the absolute foundation of victory. They refuse to send combat troops into the unforgiving Pacific without a massive, redundant umbilical cord tying them back to the factories of the mainland. The United States military develops a radical tail-to-teeth ratio. For every single Marine or infantryman pulling a trigger on the front line, there are up to a dozen men behind him, stevedores, truck drivers, supply clerks, and railway engineers, dedicated entirely to keeping him fed, armed, and equipped. The logistics chain stretches across 8,000 miles of hostile ocean. A crate of canned rations manufactured in Ohio is loaded onto a train to San Francisco, lifted by crane into the hold of a Liberty ship, transported in a heavily escorted convoy to a staging base in Australia or Hawaii, and finally carried by a landing craft to a contested beachhead. To sustain this incredible flow, the Americans begin constructing massive floating supply bases. They drag millions of tons of concrete, pierced steel planking, and aviation fuel across the sea, effectively bringing the infrastructure of a modern industrial city to remote coral atolls that had never previously seen a combustion engine. While the Japanese soldier is ordered to survive on captured rice and forge discipline, the American soldier is backed by an avalanche of material wealth. The United States Quartermaster Corps calculates caloric intake down to the decimal point, developing specialized ski rations and pea rations designed to withstand tropical heat. They ship millions of doses of quinine and attabrini to combat malaria. They send waterproof ponchos, fresh socks, heavy artillery shells, and millions of gallons of diesel fuel. It is an overwhelming mechanized tide of abundance. And as the American counteroffensive finally begins to push into the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, this tidal wave of steel and supplies is about to crash head-on into the starving, overextended ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army. This collision begins not with the crossing of bayonets, but with the roar of earth-moving equipment. On the island of Guadalcanal, Japanese engineers painstakingly hack an airfield out of the jungle. It is agonizing, primitive work. Men swing pickaxes in the sweltering heat, their uniforms soaked in sweat and rain. They fell massive mahogany trees by hand and dragged the heavy timber away using ropes, pulleys, and pure, exhausting muscle. To level a single uneven runway takes months of backbreaking labor, fueled by steadily dwindling rations. Then the Americans land. The airfield is quickly captured and handed over to a new breed of soldier, the United States Naval Construction Battalions, famously known as the Seabees. The watching Japanese, hidden in the surrounding jungle canopy, are subjected to a technological spectacle that defies their comprehension. Diesel engines roar to life across the perimeter. Massive Caterpillar D-8 bulldozers tear through the dense foliage, uprooting in seconds what took Japanese platoons days to clear. Motorized graders flatten the earth with effortless precision. Within hours, the Seabees are laying down interlocking strips of Marston matting heavy, perforated steel planks that instantly create an all-weather runway over the mud. Where the Japanese fought the jungle with hand tools, the Americans literally pave over it with heavy machinery. The speed of this transformation is a tactical weapon in itself, ensuring American fighter planes control the skies almost immediately after a beachhead is secured. This mechanized supremacy extends directly to the front lines, dictating the very rhythm of combat. The Japanese artilleryman is a master of camouflage and precision, but he is fundamentally paralyzed by a lack of ammunition. Deep in the jagged ridges of New Guinea or the limestone caves of the Solomons, heavy field guns are dragged up sheer cliffs by human sweat. Every single 75mm shell is treated as a precious commodity. They are strictly rationed, calculated, and fired only when absolute devastation is guaranteed. The American gunner faces no such restrictions. Backed by an unbreakable chain of supply ships, the United States Army and Marine Corps bring an apocalyptic volume of fire to the Pacific. They do not fire single, carefully aimed shots to conserve powder. Instead, they unleash coordinated, devastating barrages. Thousands of high-explosive shells rain down on Japanese positions day and night, turning dense jungle into splintered wastelands. For the Japanese infantrymen enduring the barrage in a shallow trench, the earth shakes constantly. He realizes with chilling clarity that the enemy is not worried about running out of ammunition. The enemy is simply using steel to do the work of men. Behind the guns, the disparity in transport is equally profound. to supply their forward positions in the unforgiving Owen Stanley Mountains of New Guinea. The Imperial Japanese Army relies almost entirely on human pack mules. Emaciated soldiers trudge through waist-deep mud along the Kokoda track, carrying 80-pound sacks of rice and heavy machine gun parts on their backs. When a man collapses from malaria, dysentery, or sheer exhaustion, the vital cargo is either abandoned to the rot or piled onto the shoulders of another starving soldier. It is a slow, agonizing trickle of supplies that bleeds the army dry before it even engages the enemy. On the American side, the combustion engine reigns supreme. The legendary 2.5-ton cargo truck, affectionately known as the Deuce and a Half, forms the mechanized backbone of the Allied advance. Convoys of these rugged all-wheel drive vehicles churn through the mud, delivering tons of supplies directly to forward bases. Where roads do not exist, amphibious tractors LV-T alligators and DUKWS swim through the surf and crawl right onto the beaches, bypassing treacherous coral reefs entirely. The Jeep, a nimble four-wheel drive marvel, navigates narrow jungle tracks, ferrying commanders, wounded men, and vital communications equipment with unprecedented speed. The American war machine moves on wheels, tracks, and hulls, insulating its soldiers from the worst of the jungle's friction. But the true devastation of this logistical disparity is not just measured in tons of steel or miles of paved runway. It is measured in the profound, crushing psychological toll it takes on the minds of the men forced to watch it. In the damp subterranean caves of the Pacific, the true cost of this logistical disparity is recorded in blood and pencil. Across islands from the Solomons to the Marianas, advancing American forces continually discover small, mud-stained notebooks clutched in the hands of fallen Japanese soldiers. These diaries are rarely filled with fanatical declarations of imperial glory. Instead, they are desperate, agonizing ledgers of starvation. Page after page details the slow, humiliating decay of the human body. Soldiers record the onset of beriberi, watching their limbs swell and turn numb from vitamin deficiency. They document the loss of teeth to scurvy and the relentless gnawing pain in their empty stomachs. The formidable infantrymen of the emperor, trained to conquer Asia, are reduced to hunting for lizards, boiling bitter roots, and catching stagnant rainwater in rusting helmets. The moral foundation of the invincible warrior spirit begins to crack under the biological reality of malnutrition. A man cannot execute a fearless banzai charge when he is too weak to stand. This physical degradation is magnified infinitely by the agonizing proximity of the enemy. From their concealed ridgelines, starving Japanese observers look down upon American encampments. They do not just see an opposing army. They see a civilization exported across the ocean. The American infantryman is robust, well-fed, and clothed in specialized herringbone twill jungle fatigues. When his uniform rots from the tropical humidity, a quartermaster instantly issues a fresh set. When his boots disintegrate on the jagged coral, he is handed a new waterproof pair. The psychological warfare waged by this abundance is entirely unintentional, but brutally effective. The scent of American field kitchens drifts upward through the jungle canopy. While the Japanese soldier boils a handful of scavenged grass, the evening breeze carries the unmistakable aroma of brewing coffee, frying bacon, and hot stew. It is a sensory torment that shatters morale faster than incoming artillery fire. Captured Japanese prisoners repeatedly admit that the sight of discarded American trash was the exact moment they lost faith in the war. Finding half-eaten tins of meat, wrappers of chocolate, and unopened cartons of cigarettes casually thrown into the dirt forces a terrifying realization. The enemy possesses such staggering wealth that they can afford to throw away more calories than a Japanese platoon consumes in a week. The United States military understands that morale is a measurable resource, directly tied to the supply chain. In an unprecedented display of logistical dominance, the American High Command insists on delivering the comforts of home to the most hostile environments on Earth. During the holidays, Refrigerated ships brave submarine-infested waters to deliver thousands of frozen turkeys, complete with cranberry sauce, to Marines fighting in the malarial swamps of the South Pacific. It is an industrial flex of unimaginable proportions. Yet, nothing symbolizes this absolute supremacy, quite like the United States Navy's approach to ice cream. As the fleet advances deeper into the Pacific, the military classifies ice cream as an essential morale-building commodity. Millions of dollars are spent outfitting specialized vessels, including concrete barges with industrial freezers and churning machinery, capable of producing thousands of gallons of ice cream per shift. These floating factories are towed into forward anchorages, serving cold, sweet relief to sailors and Marines who have just rotated off the firing line. To the Japanese High Command in Tokyo, this concept is completely alien, viewed as an insult to their ascetic, hardened warrior ethos. But to the starving Japanese soldier watching from the shoreline, it is the ultimate psychological defeat. A nation that struggles to ship a single sack of rice to its frontline troops cannot possibly defeat a nation that engineers, builds, and deploys specialized ships solely to manufacture dessert in a combat zone. This stark contrast breeds a profound, quiet despair within the Japanese ranks. The frontline soldiers recognize the fatal flaw of their own commanders, who demand absolute suicidal sacrifice, but provide zero logistical support for survival. The men are ordered to hold their ground to the last bullet, essentially abandoned to starve in the darkness while the enemy feasts in the light. The samurai spirit is being slowly suffocated by the sheer crushing weight of American supply lines. The stage is now set for the decisive battles of attrition, where this fragile Japanese network will be pushed past its breaking point. The breaking point arrives in the late summer of 1942, on an obscure volcanic island in the Solomons, Guadalcanal. For 6 agonizing months, this patch of jungle becomes the ultimate testing ground between Japanese willpower and American industry. The United States Marines seize the vital airstrip, Henderson Field, immediately anchoring their position with a steady flow of material. While the Japanese starve in the surrounding mud, the Marines are eating hot chow, receiving continuous shipments of ammunition, and watching Seabees patch runway craters almost as fast as enemy bombers can create them. The Japanese Imperial High Command, blinded by their own offensive doctrine, refuses to concede the island. They funnel thousands of soldiers onto Guadalcanal, determined to crush the American beachhead. But they fundamentally fail to secure the waters around it. Because daylight belongs to the American Cactus Air Force, the slow, lumbering Japanese supply ships are slaughtered from above before they even see the coastline. To counter this, the Imperial Japanese Navy is forced to deploy the Tokyo Express. Under the cover of darkness, sleek, heavily armed destroyers are stripped of their torpedoes and packed with infantry and rice. They sprint down the oceanic channel known as the Slot, frantically offloading men in the dead of night before fleeing ahead of the dawn. It is a desperate tactical adaptation, but a disastrous logistical failure. Destroyers are built for speed and surface combat, not cargo. They cannot carry heavy field artillery, earth-moving equipment, or anywhere near sufficient food for a protracted siege. The situation quickly deteriorates into a macabre struggle for basic sustenance. By November 1942, American naval and air superiority is so absolute that the Tokyo Express can no longer safely linger near the coast to unload. Japanese sailors resort to filling empty oil drums with rice and medical supplies, lashing them together with ropes, and rolling them off the decks of moving destroyers. The desperate plan relies on the ocean currents to wash these vital barrels ashore. Instead, American PT boats and strafing fighter planes actively hunt the floating supply drops, shooting the barrels until they sink. Starving Japanese infantrymen wade into the treacherous surf under heavy machine gun fire, desperately trying to drag the surviving drums to the beach. Many drown, pulled under by the weight of their own emaciated bodies. Inside the jungle canopy, the command structure of the Japanese 17th Army begins to disintegrate. General Harukichi Hayakataki's forces are paralyzed, Troops are dying at a rate of 50 per day from malnutrition and malaria, outnumbering those killed by American bullets. The caloric intake of a Japanese soldier drops to a fraction of the minimum requirement for human survival. Veterans later recall the gruesome reality of their comrades' teeth falling out, and of men losing the ability to see in the dark due to severe vitamin deficiencies. The island earns a grim new moniker in the Japanese lexicon, Gatu, the island of starvation. Weapons rust, wounds turn gangrenous without bandages, and the once feared night assaults lose their ferocity as men simply lack the physical strength to charge. 1,000 miles to the west, a parallel tragedy unfolds in the razor-sharp ridges of New Guinea. Major General Tomitaro Hori's elite South Seas detachment pushes relentlessly over the Kokoda Track toward the Allied base at Port Moresby. They advance with terrifying speed, driving the Australian defenders back through the mountains. But in September 1942, just 30 miles from their objective, the Japanese offensive simply stops. It is not halted by superior enemy tactics, but by the absolute collapse of their own supply line. Hori's men have outrun their food. The brutal vertical mountain terrain makes mechanized transport impossible, and human porters are dying of exhaustion on the muddy trails. The soldiers are forced to eat roots, grass, and eventually the unthinkable. When the order to retreat is finally given, it is not a tactical withdrawal, but a disorganized death march. The invincible Japanese infantry, undefeated for months across the Pacific, is rooted by the sheer impossibility of surviving without calories. The myth of living off the land is buried forever in the mud of the Owen Stanley Range. Guadalcanal and New Guinea marked the death of the Japanese offensive, proving with fatal clarity that spiritual endurance cannot substitute for logistical reality. But the nightmare for the Imperial Army is only just beginning, as the American war machine prepares to scale its production, isolating and bypassing entire island fortresses across the ocean. By late 1943, the United States military perfects a new devastating strategic doctrine. The American High Command, led by General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, recognizes a fundamental vulnerability in the Japanese defensive perimeter. They realize they do not need to launch bloody amphibious assaults against every heavily fortified island. They only need to sever the enemy's logistical arteries. This strategy, known as island hopping or leapfrogging, weaponizes America's overwhelming advantage in mobility and supply. The crown jewel of the Japanese South Pacific Empire is Rabaul, located on the island of New Britain. It is a sprawling, formidable fortress. Over 100,000 heavily armed Imperial troops are dug deep into a massive network of volcanic tunnels, manning hundreds of artillery pieces and anti-aircraft batteries. They are primed for a glorious, decisive battle, fully prepared to bleed the invading American fleet dry. But the American fleet never comes. Instead, Allied forces deliberately bypass Rabaul. They seize weakly defended, neighboring atolls just out of reach of the Japanese guns. Within days, CB battalions bulldoze fresh runways out of the coral. From these newly established airfields, American bomber squadrons subject Rabaul to a relentless, unyielding aerial siege. They do not target the heavily entrenched infantry, they target the harbor. Every Japanese transport ship, supply barge, and escort vessel attempting to reach the fortress is ruthlessly hunted down and sunk. The umbilical cord to Tokyo is permanently severed. The mighty garrison of Rabaul is rendered entirely strategically impotent without a single American infantryman stepping foot on its beaches. Tens of thousands of elite combat troops, men who conquered Southeast Asia, are suddenly trapped in a heavily armed prison of their own making. Stripped of incoming food shipments, they are forced to lay down their Type 99 rifles and pick up hoes. The emperor's finest warriors become subsistence farmers, desperately planting sweet potatoes and cultivating gardens in the volcanic ash simply to stave off starvation. This terrifying strategy of isolation is replicated across the Pacific theater, from the impenetrable fortress of Truk Lagoon to the dense jungles of Bougainville, and later throughout the Philippine archipelago. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers are deliberately left behind the advancing American lines. They are effectively removed from the war, transformed into ghosts guarding irrelevant outposts. For the isolated Japanese soldier, the psychological horror of this realization is absolute. Standing on the shores of a bypassed atoll, a starving infantryman looks out at the horizon. He does not see an invading fleet coming to fight him in honorable combat. Instead, he bears witness to an unbelievable procession of American naval power. He watches dozens of Essex-class aircraft carriers, hundreds of destroyers, and massive logistical train ships steaming silently past his island, heading straight toward the Japanese home islands. The American Armada brings its entire industrial base across the ocean. The United States Navy deploys service squadrons, massive floating cities, comprised of repair ships, floating dry docks, hospital ships, and refrigerated supply vessels. They can weld new bows onto damaged cruisers in the open ocean and pump millions of gallons of aviation fuel without ever returning to a permanent port. While the Japanese garrison boils seawater to extract salt and scavenges for edible ferns, the American fleet passing by their shores is eating fresh bread, repairing radar arrays, and preparing for the next offensive. The Japanese soldier realizes he is not even worth the ammunition required to kill him. The Americans possess so much fuel, so many ships, and such absolute crushing control of the ocean that they can simply ignore his existence. The martial spirit, the willingness to die a glorious death for the emperor, is rendered completely irrelevant in the face of this mechanized abundance. A soldier cannot launch a suicidal banzai charge against a fleet of transport ships sailing 10 miles offshore. He can only watch them pass, feeling the cold, creeping dread that his empire is already defeated. This is the ultimate turning point of the Pacific War. The conflict has evolved from a series of contested infantry clashes into a colossal, mechanized siege that is slowly starving the enemy to death. The vast distances of the ocean, once Japan's greatest defensive barrier, have been conquered by American logistics. And this slow, deliberate strangulation of the bypassed outposts is merely a prelude to the devastating blockade that is about to tighten around the throat of the Japanese home islands themselves. When the guns finally fall silent across the scattered atolls of the Pacific, the true horrifying arithmetic of the logistical war is revealed. The statistics of the conflict do not merely tell a story of tactical defeat. They document an unprecedented biological catastrophe. Of the estimated 1.7 million Imperial Japanese Army soldiers who perished during the Pacific Campaign, military historians calculate that more than 1 million do not die from American bullets, artillery, or aerial bombardment. They are killed by their own severed supply lines. Starvation, severe malnutrition, and unchecked tropical diseases account for a staggering 60% of the Japanese military death toll. Entire divisions are erased from the order of battle without ever engaging in a major firefight. In the dense jungles of Bougainville, the mountains of the Philippines, and the bypassed limestone caves of the Marianas, the emperor's finest infantrymen simply waste away. Medical officers, completely bereft of quinine or bandages, can do nothing but watch as malaria and dysentery hollow out their regiments. The invincible warrior spirit, so highly prized by the High Command in Tokyo, is ultimately broken by a profound lack of calories. But the slow death of the isolated island garrisons is only the outer edge of the disaster. The American logistical stranglehold inevitably tightens around the throat of the Japanese home islands themselves. Having mastered the art of supplying their own forces across the vast ocean, the United States military sets out to ensure that the Japanese cannot move a single pound of cargo. Beneath the waves, the United States Navy's submarine fleet executes a campaign of absolute, ruthless efficiency. The silent service forms an invisible iron ring around Japan. American submariners do not just hunt formidable warships. They systematically slaughter the vulnerable Morro merchant fleet. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies are torpedoed in the Makassar Strait. Cargo ships hauling vital rice and bauxite from the Asian mainland are sent to the bottom of the South China Sea. By the final year of the war, the ocean floor is paved with the wreckage of Japan's logistical lifeblood. Above the water, American B-29 superfortresses, flying from the very islands that Seabees paved over just months prior, execute Operation Starvation. They drop thousands of acoustic and magnetic naval mines directly into the vital shipping lanes of the Shimonoseki Strait and Japan's inland waterways. The maritime arteries of the empire suffer a total catastrophic thrombosis. The effects on the Japanese mainland are immediate and devastating. The massive industrial factories of Tokyo and Osaka grind to a dead halt, completely starved of imported steel, coal, and oil. But more terrifying is the collapse of the food supply. Japan is fundamentally an island nation reliant on imported calories and coastal fishing to feed its millions of citizens. With the fishing fleets confined to port by American mines, and the transport ships resting at the bottom of the ocean, the civilian population faces the exact same agony as their soldiers rotting in the South Pacific. Rations in the major cities are slashed to starvation levels. Civilians are instructed to forage for acorns and mix sawdust into their meager bowls of rice to create the illusion of a full meal. The mighty industrial empire, which once boasted of living off the land of its conquered enemies, is now trapped, starving on its own sovereign soil. The sheer, overwhelming weight of American material abundance has effectively neutralized a nation of 70 million people, preparing the ground for the final psychological shock that awaits the survivors emerging from the jungle. August 1945. The static-filled voice of Emperor Hirohito echoes from radios across the Pacific, ordering the unimaginable, the cessation of hostilities. In the deepest, darkest pockets of the bypassed islands, from the rugged ridges of Luzon to the malarial swamps of Bougainville, the ghosts of the Imperial Japanese Army slowly materialize. They step out from the jungle canopy not as the fearsome conquerors of 1942, but as skeletal specters. Their uniforms are rotting rags, their rifles rusted shut, their bodies ravaged by years of untreated beriberi and starvation. As they march down to the coastlines to surrender their swords to American patrols, they brace themselves for the harsh reality of captivity. What they encounter instead is a psychological shock far more devastating than any artillery barrage. The prisoners of war are loaded onto landing craft and transported to established American staging areas. As the landing ramps drop, the starving Japanese soldiers are forced to confront the absolute, staggering scale of the enemy's wealth. They are guided into logistical hubs that resemble sprawling modern cities. On islands where Japanese garrisons had literally eaten the bark off trees to survive, the United States military has laid down miles of multi-lane asphalt highways. The prisoners stare in stunned silence at endless, geometrically perfect rows of heavy bombers parked wingtip to wingtip. They see mountains of weatherproof shipping crates stacked higher than the surrounding hillsides, containing millions of tons of rations, ammunition, and replacement parts. Night falls over the encampments, but the darkness is banished. Diesel generators roar to life, powering banks of massive floodlights that illuminate the docks with the intensity of the noonday sun. The work of unloading Liberty ships continues uninterrupted in a mechanized ballet of cranes, forklifts, and heavy trucks. The Japanese veterans, men who had dragged artillery pieces by hand through knee-deep mud in complete darkness to avoid detection, watch in disbelief. They see American stevedores using specialized machines to effortlessly lift cargo that would have required the agonizing labor of an entire Japanese infantry company. The sheer casualness of this abundance shatters the fundamental bedrock of their martial philosophy. But the final crushing blow to their worldview is delivered in the mess halls. The emaciated prisoners are handed metal trays and directed toward American field kitchens. They are served heaping portions of steamed white rice, canned meats, fresh vegetables, and hot coffee. To men who had watched their comrades die in agony over a single scavenged yam, The sight of such limitless sustenance is incomprehensible. Veterans of the Imperial Army, hardened combat officers who had survived years of unimaginable terror and deprivation without shedding a tear, finally break down. They sit in the blinding light of the American mess tents and weep. These are not tears of relief, nor are they simply tears of military defeat. They are tears of profound, agonizing realization. The surviving Japanese soldiers understand, in that exact moment, the complete and utter futility of their suffering. They had been ordered to fight a war of spiritual endurance against a nation that possessed the industrial capacity to pave the ocean. Their high command had demanded absolute sacrifice, sending them to the edge of the world with no means of survival, while the enemy had brought the comforts of an entire civilization to the front lines. The invincible samurai spirit had not been defeated by superior courage, but completely smothered by an endless avalanche of steel and grain. This devastating truth echoes far beyond the sprawling supply depots, leaving a permanent scar on the history of human conflict. The Pacific theater of the Second World War fundamentally rewrote the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of human conflict. For centuries, military strategy had been deeply intertwined with the romanticized ideal of the warrior spirit. The Imperial Japanese Army took this ancient ascetic philosophy to its absolute fanatical extreme. They marched into the vastness of the ocean, believing that purity of will, forged through brutal discipline and absolute loyalty, could bend physical reality. They believed that a soldier fighting for the emperor could simply ignore the biological necessity of food, conquer the debilitating friction of the jungle, and overcome the sheer, crushing weight of enemy steel. But the rotting jungles of Guadalcanal, the razor-sharp ridges of New Guinea, and the silent, bypassed atolls of the Marianas prove that courage can never be a substitute for calories. The American war machine introduced a cold, terrifying new era of mechanized attrition. In this new age, victory was no longer solely decided by the bravery of the infantrymen charging with a bayonet. It was decided by the shipbuilder in a California dry dock, the quartermaster calculating tonnage in Hawaii, and the CB driving a bulldozer thousands of miles from the front line. The United States did not just defeat the Japanese Empire with superior combat tactics. They suffocated it beneath an oceanic avalanche of logistical supremacy. When those starving Japanese veterans wept over plates of fresh food in the blinding light of American supply depots, they were not just mourning the loss of their fallen comrades. They were grieving the death of an entire martial worldview. In the shadow of those endless mountains of wooden crates, they realized that the era of the samurai had been permanently eclipsed by the unrelenting rhythm of the assembly line. The Pacific Campaign remains a haunting, undeniable testament to the modern reality of warfare. It proved, once and for all, that while an army may fight with its heart, it can only survive on its supply lines.